In the Republic, Plato gives us history's first comprehensive theory of political decay, a five-stage countdown to governmental disaster that looks like a medical diagnosis of societies across time. The patient is society, and it keeps catching the same disease with different symptoms. And 2,400 years later, we're still ignoring the doctor's advice. What a shame. But fortunately, Plato has some ideas. Plato's ideal government, the aristocracy ruled by philosopher-kings, is the political equivalent of that perfect relationship you fantasize about but never actually find. Its rulers possess both the wisdom to know what's right and the moral character to actually do it. Until philosophers are kings, or the kings and princes of this world have the spirit and power of philosophy, cities will never have rest from their evils. This government by the wisest still remains the most influential political unicorn in history. Everyone agrees it would be wonderful. No one has ever seen it or trusts it entirely. Modern technocracies, with their credentialed experts and data-driven policies, attempt a pale imitation, promising rule by the knowledgeable without ensuring they're also good. We've created systems where brilliant minds design facial recognition software to surveil populations and algorithms to maximize addiction. All the expertise with none of the wisdom, if you ask me. When today's leaders claim to follow the science, they're making a Platonic appeal to knowledge-based authority. But Plato would point out the critical difference. His philosophers comprehend the good itself, not just specialized technical knowledge. Silicon Valley billionaires, academic experts, and policy wonks might qualify as knowers, but would they pass Plato's character test? As we entrust increasing power to experts who understand AI, genetic engineering, and nuclear physics, Plato's insistence that wisdom without virtue creates monsters seems less antiquated by the day. The first step downward is timocracy, which emerges when spirit, thumos, eclipses reason, creating a society obsessed with honor, victory, and military values. Such a state is intermediate between aristocracy and oligarchy. It is a lover of honor, but less purely so than aristocracy. Sound familiar? From North Korea's military parades to America's worship of the troops, from Russia's cultivation of a warrior ethos to the constant invocation of national greatness, timocratic impulses exist in modern states. The timocratic personality, ambitious, competitive, status-conscious, thrives in our political systems regardless of ideology. Plato describes the timocratic man as somewhat deaf in the better ear, listening more to spirited ambition than reasoned wisdom. He's the politician who starts wars to boost approval ratings, the leader who measures success in victory rather than prosperity. In America, phrases like national security, patriotism, and strength function as magic words that suspend critical thinking. Like Plato's timocrats, we conflate military spending with safety and confuse belligerence with courage. The timocratic fixation on external threats, real and imagined, distracts from internal corruption. Military powers portray themselves as perpetually under siege, just as Sparta, Plato's timocratic exemplar, maintained constant vigilance against Helot rebellion. Today's surveillance states justify domestic spying through appeals to external threats, turning citizens into potential enemies. The timocratic playbook remains remarkably consistent. Cultivate fear, glorify strength, and measure greatness in military rather than moral terms. And when money replaces honor as society's ultimate value, timocracy degenerates into oligarchy. Plato's diagnosis is brutally precise. Such a city is not one but two, the city of the rich and the city of the poor, dwelling together and always plotting against one another. 24 centuries later, wealth inequality would make Plato's head spin. The richest 1% now own more wealth than the bottom 90%, combined in many nations. Political systems across ideological spectrums increasingly serve concentrated wealth regardless of their stated principles. Behind democracy's formal equality lurks the oligarchic reality of donor influence, corporate lobbying, and revolving doors between government and industry. Plato identified the wealthy's greatest trick, convincing everyone that what benefits the rich benefits all. Modern supply-side economics, the belief that favoring the wealthy creates prosperity for everyone, would fit perfectly in Plato's oligarchic playbook. As he noted, oligarchies create an underclass of drones, some with stings, criminals, revolutionaries, and some without, the passive poor, both products of systemic exclusion. The property qualifications that formerly restricted political participation in ancient oligarchies have been replaced by more subtle barriers. Complex registration requirements, voter ID laws, felon disenfranchisement, workday elections, and the overwhelming influence of campaign finance. The result mirrors what Plato described: formal citizenship without meaningful political power for many. Most tellingly, Plato understood that oligarchies eventually collapse under the weight of their contradictions. A system that concentrates wealth while impoverishing the majority creates instability that leads to democratic revolution. The rising populist movements across today's political spectrum, from democratic socialism to nationalist populism, suggest we may be witnessing precisely the transition Plato described from oligarchic excess to democratic reaction. Plato's analysis of democracy reads like he had access to a time machine and spent a weekend watching cable news. Democracy emerges when the poor overthrow the rich, establishing freedom and equality as supreme values. But this government by the unqualified elevates liberty over wisdom. The excessive increase of anything often causes a reaction in the opposite direction. And so tyranny naturally arises out of democracy, and the most aggravated form of tyranny and slavery out of the most extreme form of liberty. In democratic Athens, Plato witnessed how flattering demagogues could manipulate assemblies through emotional appeals rather than reasoned arguments. Today's 24-hour news cycles, social media echo chambers, and political polarization have supercharged this dynamic. The democratic tendency to value opinion equally regardless of expertise makes societies vulnerable to misinformation, a tendency exponentially amplified by technologies that democratize publishing while eliminating traditional gatekeepers. Plato's most cutting observation was that democracy's celebration of absolute freedom and equality undermines all authority and distinction. When a democratic city, athirst for freedom, has evil cupbearers presiding over the feast, and has drunk too deeply of the strong wine of freedom, then it calls good men who obey the rulers the slaves of voluntary servitude. The result? A society where the teacher fears and flatters his scholars and the scholars despise their teachers, where the old condescend to the young and are full of pleasantry and gaiety. They mimic the young for fear of being thought morose. This erosion of natural authority structures creates what Plato calls anarchic equality, a flattening of all distinctions that makes governance impossible. Our current crisis of expertise, where scientific consensus on issues from climate change to vaccines is rejected as just another opinion, exemplifies this democratic pathology. The Internet's democratization of information has paradoxically made it harder to distinguish between credible knowledge and misinformation. When an epidemiologist's guidance carries the same weight as a YouTube conspiracy theorist's rant, Plato's critique of democracy as rule by the ignorant feels uncomfortably prescient. The democratic personality, pulled in all directions by undisciplined desires, manifests in consumer society's celebration of choice without purpose. Our political discourse increasingly resembles what Plato described: passionate intensity without philosophical depth, a marketplace of opinions where the loudest voice, not the wisest, prevails. The final stage of political degeneration arrives when democracy's celebration of unbounded freedom creates such disorder that people welcome a strongman who promises to restore order. The people have always some champion whom they set over them and nurse into greatness. This and no other is the root from which a tyrant springs. When he first appears, he is a protector. The tyrant emerges not despite democracy but because of it, exploiting its excesses while claiming to cure them. Modern authoritarian populists follow this Platonic script with remarkable fidelity. Position yourself as the people's champion against corrupt elites, scapegoat vulnerable minorities, exploit fear of social disorder, undermine institutional checks, and transform popular discontent into personal power. What begins with promises to protect the people ends with their enslavement. The tyrant initially eliminates the enemies of the people, usually the wealthy and powerful, but soon requires enemies to maintain his position. If he is to rule, he must continually stir up war so that the people will continue to need a leader. This psychology explains why modern autocrats maintain permanent crises. Whether literal wars or metaphorical ones against immigrants, minorities, or external threats. The perpetual emergency justifies extraordinary powers that would otherwise be recognized as tyrannical. The tyrant's personal psychology mirrors his political role, representing appetite completely unleashed from reason's guidance. Today's aspiring tyrants display what Plato described: dominant personalities driven by insatiable desire rather than principle. Many exhibit the characteristic tyrant's trait of projecting strength while being consumed by inner fear, which explains their paranoid purges of potential rivals. Plato's cycle of regimes suggests today's democracies may be vulnerable to tyrannical degeneration, not from external conquest, but from internal processes. The rise of authoritarian populism across democratic systems indicates we may be witnessing precisely the transition Plato described. What makes his analysis uniquely valuable is recognizing that political institutions reflect citizen character. The best constitution cannot produce justice among unjust souls. This insight helps explain why constitutional protections alone prove insufficient against democratic backsliding. Institutional safeguards cannot withstand a population willing to sacrifice freedom for security, complexity for simplicity, and truth for comforting lies. Plato's solution, philosophical education that cultivates wisdom and virtue, sounds quaint in our utilitarian educational systems focused on economic productivity rather than character formation. Yet his diagnosis suggests that, without addressing the spiritual and intellectual foundations of citizenship, institutional reforms merely treat symptoms while the disease progresses. His mixed constitution, later developed by Aristotle and Polybius, anticipated modern liberal democracies' attempt to balance competing principles through institutional design. Our systems of checks and balances, constitutional limits on majority rule, and independent judiciaries follow Platonism in regards to the need to constrain democracy's inherent tendencies toward excess. Plato's way of treating forms of government is a diagnostic tool for analyzing our contemporary political dysfunctions. His cycle of regimes reminds us that similar patterns of political degeneration recur across drastically different contexts. Not because history literally repeats, but because human psychology remains remarkably consistent. Stubbornly human, it is what it is. When we recognize our societies in Plato's description of late-stage democracy, characterized by extreme individualism, rejection of authority, celebration of desire over reason, and vulnerability to demagoguery, we gain perspective on challenges that might otherwise seem uniquely modern. This recognition doesn't provide easy solutions, but offers a conceptual framework for understanding how democracies undermine themselves through their own excesses. The ultimate value of Platonic analysis is the confrontation of uncomfortable questions about the relationship between governance and virtue. If political systems ultimately reflect the character of their citizens, then perhaps political reform requires spiritual renewal. This recognition that politics cannot be separated from ethics remains Plato's most challenging legacy for our technocratic age. And at the same time, it becomes an individual and intimate problem too. If Plato was the visionary dreamer of political philosophy, his student Aristotle was its pragmatic scientist. While his teacher constructed ideal regimes, Aristotle dissected actual ones. The man collected and analyzed 158 different constitutions, for heaven's sake. Talk about empirical research. Where Plato ascended to metaphysical heights, Aristotle rolled up his sleeves and got his hands dirty with political reality. Aristotle begins with a simple observation that changes everything. Man is by nature a political animal. This is the foundation of all his political thinking. Unlike modern contract theorists who see government as an artificial invention to solve problems, Aristotle sees political association as natural as breathing. The polis belongs to the class of things that exist by nature, and man is by nature a political animal. He who by nature and not by mere accident is without a state is either a bad man or above humanity. In other words, humans without political communities are not free. They are incomplete. We're not individuals who reluctantly form societies. We're inherently social beings who can only become fully human through political association. This flips our modern individualism on its head. For Aristotle, the isolated individual isn't the natural state disrupted by society. The individual embedded in his community is the natural state. This has massive implications for how we think about government. Modern Americans talk about getting government off our backs, as if the natural state is freedom from political constraints. Aristotle would find this bizarre, like a hand claiming independence from the body. The polis doesn't restrict human nature, it fulfills it. But unlike Plato's linear decay through 5 regimes, Aristotle gives us a neater system. 3 good forms of government and their 3 corrupt counterparts. His taxonomy implies practical outcomes. The true forms of government are those in which the one, or the few, or the many, govern with a view to the common interest, but governments which rule with a view to the private interest, whether of the one or of the few or of the many, are perversions. So we get monarchy, rule by one for common good, transforms into tyranny, rule by one for private benefit. Aristocracy, rule by few for common good, transforms into oligarchy, rule by few for private benefit. Polity, rule by many for common good, transforms into democracy, rule by many for private benefit. Wait, democracy as a corrupt form? That's right. Aristotle doesn't share our worship of democracy. For him, raw democracy means majority rule without constitutional limits. Basically 2 wolves and a lamb voting on what's for dinner. What we call liberal democracy, with its constitutional protections for minorities, would be closer to his polity. Rule by many with structural safeguards against majority tyranny. This classification system still helps us diagnose modern governments. When we see leaders using public office for personal enrichment, we're watching Aristotle's perversion principle in action. When elected officials serve special interests rather than the common good, we're witnessing the slide from polity to democracy in Aristotle's sense. The distinction between good and corrupt forms doesn't depend on who rules, but on whose benefit they rule for. This cuts through our modern obsession with governmental structures to ask the more fundamental question: does this system serve the many or the few? A democracy that primarily benefits economic elites functions as an oligarchy regardless of its elections. A monarchy that genuinely serves the common welfare would be preferable to a corrupt republic by Aristotle's standards. While Plato pined for philosopher-kings, Aristotle proposed something more attainable: the polity, a mixed constitution blending oligarchic and democratic elements. He recognized that most states contain both rich and poor citizens with conflicting interests. Rather than letting either group dominate, the polity incorporates both perspectives. A constitution based on the middle class is the mean between the extremes of oligarchy and democracy. This middle-class government avoids both the tyranny of wealth and the chaos of unchecked populism. Its stability through moderation is a political golden mean. The American founders, deeply influenced by Aristotle, designed a system with similar balancing elements: a Senate representing propertied interests, balanced against a more democratic House, an electoral college mediating pure majority rule, separation of powers preventing any single faction from dominating. Today's hollow middle class and extreme inequality would alarm Aristotle. He believed that where the middle class is large, there least occur factions and divisions among citizens. As our middle class shrinks and polarization grows, we're living out Aristotle's warning about what happens when the moderating center collapses. The genius of Aristotle's polity lies in its recognition that different social classes have legitimate perspectives that need representation. Rather than wishing away class conflict through philosopher-kings or pretending all citizens have identical interests, he built class tension into his ideal system as a feature, not a bug. The wealthy bring concerns about property rights and economic stability. The poor bring concerns about equity and basic needs. A healthy polity balances both. Our current populist challenges on both left and right reflect what happens when this balance fails. When economic elites capture democratic institutions while working classes feel their concerns are ignored. Aristotle wouldn't be surprised. Unlike modern political scientists who focus on institutions, Aristotle understood that constitutions rest on social foundations. His analysis of revolution remains startlingly relevant. Inferiors revolt in order that they may be equal, and equals that they may be superior. Revolution stems from specific perceptions of relative status. It's not absolute poverty that triggers revolt, but visible inequality. As he notes with dry precision, men do not become tyrants in order that they may not suffer cold. Political instability has psychological roots in human status competition. His prescription for stability? Moderation in all things. There is only one way of making a state safe from revolution, to allow no disproportionate growth. Both the rich and the poor should be allowed to live according to their own notions of happiness. Neither should be permitted to wrong the other. How far this is from our era's political extremism, when Aristotle says the stronger should be under the ban of law so they will not have greater advantage and the weaker should not be conspired against. He's articulating a principle of balanced power that our increasingly winner-take-all system ignores. His remark that constitutions are preserved by the same causes which destroy them when attended to in a different manner reveals political paradoxes we also face. Democracy requires majority rule but must protect minority rights. Economic growth creates prosperity but, if concentrated, breeds resentment. Freedom enables human flourishing but without limits produces social chaos. For Aristotle, citizenship means active participation in governance, not passive enjoyment of rights. A citizen in the strictest sense shares in the administration of justice and in offices. This active conception challenges our consumerist approach to politics. We increasingly treat the government as a service provider and citizens as customers evaluating its performance. Aristotle would find this fundamentally misguided. The citizen isn't the government's client, but its constituent part, like a cell in a body, not a customer at a store. His definition of citizenship as ruling and being ruled in turn establishes reciprocal responsibility that is essential in democracy. This rotation of leadership positions democracy as an educational system where citizens develop practical wisdom through governance experience. Contrast this with our specialist approach, where professional politicians govern while citizens merely vote. Today's low voter turnout, political disengagement and delegation of governance to experts would appear to Aristotle as signs of civic decay, not efficiency. When citizens view politics as a spectator sport, rather than a participatory activity, the body politic atrophies from disuse. Where Plato wanted philosopher-kings, Aristotle emphasized educating all citizens for virtue. The most valuable thing in a state is the careful attention to education. We want to cultivate character. Lawgivers make the citizens good by inculcating habits in them, he writes, positioning character formation as government's primary purpose. Modern education systems, focused on workforce preparation rather than civic virtue, would strike Aristotle as missing the point entirely. What good is technical knowledge without ethical judgment to guide its use? Our schools produce skilled workers, but often neglect the character development that creates good citizens. His practical approach extends to property rights. Property should be private, but the use of it common. This middle path between communism and unrestrained capitalism suggests private ownership for efficiency coupled with social obligation for justice. It's a prescription that provokes both socialist collectivism and libertarian individualism, suggesting that rights come with responsibilities. Aristotle directly argues against his teacher's more radical proposals. Against Plato's communism of property and women, he offers common-sense objections. That which is common to the greatest number receives the least care. Men pay most attention to what is their own. They care less for what is common, or at any rate they care for it only to the extent to which each is individually concerned. This insight into human incentives anticipates modern economic thinking by 2 millennia. Common ownership often creates free rider problems and diffused responsibility. Similarly, He argues that Plato's abolition of the family ignores human attachment. It is better for each child to be mine in this sense than that each of 5,000 or 10,000 citizens should regard the same child as his. Most fundamentally, Aristotle rejects Plato's assumption that maximum unity constitutes the state's proper aim. The polis is by nature a plurality, and if it becomes more and more a unity, it will first become a household instead of a polis, and then an individual instead of a household. For we should all call the household more of a unity than the polis, and the individual more than the household. So that even if we could, we ought not to achieve this object. It would be the destruction of the polis. This recognition of plurality as essential rather than problematic transforms political philosophy. Where Plato seeks to transcend differences through philosophical harmony, Aristotle accepts diversity as politics' inescapable condition. Modern pluralistic democracies with their competing interest groups reflect this Aristotelian theory that difference isn't a bug, but a feature of political life. But Aristotle's connection between ethics and politics reminds us that good governance requires good citizens. Institutional design matters, but character formation matters more. Aristotle's political thought remains vital because it bridges idealism and cynicism. He neither constructs utopian fantasies nor surrenders to power politics. Instead, he proposes practical wisdom, recognizing human limitations without abandoning aspirations toward justice. Above all, Aristotle reminds us that politics exists for human flourishing, not mere survival. A state exists for the sake of a good life and not for the sake of life only. The state's purpose transcends both, aiming at the good life in its fullest sense, a goal requiring material sufficiency but not reducible to it. This comprehensive vision of politics as ethical rather than merely procedural offers an antidote to our thin conceptions of democracy as just voting or markets. For Aristotle, political life is the context in which humans realize their nature as political animals.